Okay, I will start us off. So good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. To launch online Helen Kewell's new book, MidLife. As you know, she is in conversation with Catherine Jackson, her editor, tonight. So we have about an hour, and they will have a Q&A probably for about 45 minutes, and then that will allow time, about 15 minutes for questions from you, the audience. So as we go along, do feel free to put questions into the chat, because we'll be monitoring it as we go along. I also want to say tonight, this is the first time we are actually live streaming across the online events social platforms. So that's definitely a first for us, but I just want to make you mindful of that. So when it does come to the Q&A, just be aware that you, if you do ask a question, you will be on the live stream too. And the other thing to say is that we will put into, if you want to get hold of Helen's book and you don't have it already, or her previous one, we'll be putting links into the chat as we go. And there is also a discount code, an extra 15% off Helen's books tonight, should you be wishing to buy. So I think that's probably enough from me, and I am going to hand over to Catherine, who will introduce Helen. So thank you, everybody.
Hi, everybody. Thanks very much for turning up. It's great to see so many people here. And I, of course, am absolutely delighted to have this opportunity to grill Helen on her book, which I, worked with her as her editor, obviously. So I think we'll kick off straight away, because I've got a load of questions, probably far too many. So Helen, following on from your previous book, your first book with us, which was about working with older people nearing the end of their life, tell us what inspired you to focus on midlife this time?
Thank you for asking that question, because actually I think they're super relevant to each other, both of the books. So hello, everybody. I think it's important to say that my specialism in my counselling practice is in working with older adults and mostly, but also across the life transitions. So my writing at this point is mostly focused on final life transitions, but I noticed that the clients that I was working with who were in their midlife were grappling with really similar topics. So loss, for meaning, feeling that relevancy was waning, becoming lost a little bit in their sense of self. And at the same time this shift was happening, my own midlife transition was sort of beginning, was sort of almost disorientating and a bit dizzying, and I was noticing it in myself. At the same time as that was happening, the media coverage of menopause was really picking up pace. We had the sort of Davina effect, as you and I have spoken about, Catherine, quite a lot. So there's two questions kept coming to me, which you and I talked about a bit. So why is this time of life in women and men mostly portrayed as a time of crisis and deficit? And secondly, why aren't we as a profession talking about this life transition in the same ways as we might talk about others? So I felt really compelled, as I did with my first book, to show the richness and diversity of this experience, as well as perhaps some of the stereotypes behind it, and amplify them. And that's when I knocked on your door and said, hey, what about this book?
We said, yeah, of course, we've been waiting for it. Yeah, we'll come back to you saying that, there was stuff going on for you as well. We'll come back to that one, because that's an interesting point. But let's talk about midlife for a bit, because it means very different things for men and women, largely. Typically and stereotypically, men have a midlife crisis and women have the menopause. You talk about this in the book, obviously. Can you talk us through your thinking on that now, and why you decided to write about both men and women,
Yes.
given actually the differences, or maybe not the differences?
Well, I think that's probably where I would start answering that question. I think, first of all, it's worth mentioning that it is in equal measure helpful and unhelpful to be binary about it. I felt this way when I was writing about older age. There's a certain awareness that comes with creating a theme that makes something binary and that I feel uncomfortable with, but because there are a myriad of different experiences, but I think it's helpful to give themes. So I think first of all, it is important to acknowledge the menopause because it happens to 100% of women and we're roughly 50% of the population. And until now, well, not now, until some time ago, it was largely ignored, or we felt embarrassed about it or ashamed about it. So I think it was really, really important to bring that into the open. And as you know, Catherine, that's where it started for me, thinking about writing about it from a therapeutic perspective. But as I started to have conversations and open it up a little bit, and as I thought about my male clients who were in midlife, many of them were either in crisis or in a deep sense of transition, probably weren't aware of it, but a lot was happening on quite a deep level. And I started to notice that wasn't spoken about either, except in the way of stereotypical crisis or decline or somehow loss of power and the sorts of things you might see in the media. And for heterosexual couples, at least, these two journeys are so deeply entangled. You can't talk about one without the other, really, because you're journeying together. And if you are, and in same-sex couples, it's still journeying together. But the some of the nuances of that, I felt I couldn't do justice to if I just focused on menopause. I think it's safe to say, like you said at the end of your question, that some experiences are in fact universal. It's the first time we're facing our mortality properly. So there's nothing like midlife to make you realise that the next thing that happens in the next half of your life is going to be the end of it, if you're lucky enough to get there. Our parents are getting older, may need our care. If we have children, they may be leaving home. Other things are happening for them. We're probably underwriting them, to a large extent. Our work and our career might peak or change. So there's some of those commonalities I couldn't ignore by just taking a simple view of it, or a single lens of it within it.
But what you say about couples was something that really flew out of the book at me when I read it. It was like, well, yes, of course. Of course. As you say, well, there's a lot more coverage about the menopause recently. There's a lot more flagging up about the immense problems that a lot of women experience coping with it in work settings, all those things. But what you also do is you take a refreshingly positive look at it as there's a point of a springboard. Do you want to talk about that message a bit?
I would love to talk about that message, particularly because I know you and I played this back and forth a little bit, and you kept encouraging me. What's your phrase you used to use? Not to be too woo-woo about things, I think was your phrase. But yes, I'm very happy to ask you questions. No, I'm joking. No, so as you know, this was something I was really passionate about doing, and I do acknowledge that as a person, I am inclined to gravitate towards perhaps not always the positive, but the philosophical, let's say, in things. And I wanted to temper that, but it is important. This bit is really important to me. All of life is change. All of pain that we experience in our life changes us. And so each life transition births something new inside us. And in my own experiences, certainly, and throughout the research that I undertook for this, and I spoke to many, many people, and within my clinical practice, actually, what I noticed was that through this, new parts of people were emerging. So it was painful, but new parts were emerging, or old parts were re-emerging, and often, without really realizing it until we started to be curious about it and sort of, if you like, encourage that to happen. And these parts were possibly not accessible without that transition. So I think it's a really important, and to get specific about it, some women I spoke to found this, in fact myself included, found this deep connection with nature that was either new or much pronounced. I was talking to a woman who found herself going and sitting in the woods. Almost couldn't understand why. And as you know, I read it. And if anybody's read the book, they'll know I took to swimming in cold water. I felt the need to literally, every time I saw a piece of water, I wanted to get in it. And this is kind of something deep within me that kind of wasn't there before. Some women who felt a rage within them, and actually felt that they had permission to let that come forward, and challenge the construct they might have had previously as being overly compliant or a helper, or these are new parts that are born from, you know, what can be a bit of an onslaught. So transitions can either happen to us, or we can happen with them through being curious and being aware. And of course, therapy really helps that. It really helps that.
I mean, linked to that, for counsellors, how do you work with that in the room, I wonder? Because you've obviously got to be really careful not to, you know, go, oh, look for the positive, while somebody is just having a hideous time,
Yes.
as if anybody would. But at the same time, there's a balancing act.
I absolutely agree with that, and I would want to be very clear that I wouldn't do what you just said. But I think where that comes from, how that emerges, is through the curiosity. So, and how is that really the sorts of ways of being that we learn in our training? So how is that for you? Being kind of asking that, and how is that rage when it comes forward? I remember my counsellor, and I write about it in the book, she said, oh, you're angry, Helen. And I said, no, that doesn't feel right. And she went, rage? And I went, yeah. And I remember that just sitting inside me like, yes. And I think her next question was, what do you want to do with that? So it's those sorts of explorations, and how does that sit with you, and what might that give you, and what do you want to do with it? Those are sort of explorations that you can have that allow you to wander around things, and see all sides of it, rather than just seeing something that's very uncomfortable. And pain, there's a story in the book, it's Andrew, there's a story in the book, somebody, a man who came to me in his midlife in chronic pain, and he was really angry with his pain, but, you know, it was completely counter to everything he believed himself to be, which was strong and capable and fast moving. And so we sat with this idea for a really long time, and it was really painful, and it was a very painful emotional process for him. But eventually he began to see that what the pain brought forth for him was an awareness of his vulnerability. And as we started to explore his vulnerability, he was able to sit alongside it, feel more comfortable with it, and that opened up a whole new, as you know, Catherine, that opened up a whole new relationship depth to some of the relationships he was struggling with in his life. So you see how you come from that into something new. But you have to be very careful. I think in short, curiosity, exploration, gentle, what I would call walking around something and looking at the sort of meaning of it, gets you to that place if it's going to happen.
Turning to the men that you write about and their midlife crises, I mean, you do write obviously about several of them. There's Andrew, deeply moving story that who's looking to try a different, better way of being in his relationships. There's George, who's classically reacting to midlife by seeking to resume what he obviously regarded as a wrongly interrupted youth. I mean, I think your chapter about George is an absolute mistress piece on how a therapist confronts and contains her own somewhat judgmental reactions to a client. Do you want to tell us more about George and maybe a bit more about Andrew, but you have already spoken about it?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right to highlight that chapter. And I, in the writing process, I probably struggled with this one the most. In my own process of writing, a lot of times these stories, and they're woven stories about different people created into one, they feel like a birthing process, they flow, and this one didn't. And I know it was because I was struggling, as you say, with my response to George, or to
you'd created, yes.
the person I created, George. And actually that's really interesting. It's an interesting dilemma, because as I started to create him and weave him from a few experiences, I was then in the room with that constructed person, and I was struggling with it. So George, as you said, in the story of him in the book, is that he came because he was struggling with the levels of intimacy within his marriage, as in his wife in this vignette, his wife was going through her own midlife and menopause transition, was quite anxious and quite withdrawn and wanted to really be home and be centered, and he wanted to be out living his best life and wanted, frankly, more sex, and that's where we started. And I found myself, as you know, I found myself struggling with this dynamic and being very, I suppose, felt the pull of the stereotype of what we would call in the vernacular, the midlife crisis. And I could feel that tug all of the time. I could feel I had to really enact or kind of engage my internal supervisor to notice that in the room all the time, with fictional George and with some of the people that I was bringing into that story. I think it's really, really important to, and I took that supervision. I wrote about it in order to sort of process it myself. I think if I'm really honest, and I'm very honest in my writing, I think I missed some of the story. I missed some of the reality, and I was really struggling to hold on to him and his sense of self. And I think that it's really hard for us not to see what society wants us to see, and really, I talk about this when I'm working with people who are at the end of natural life. You have to strip away all of those things. We in the end, both in the story and in reality, with one of the individuals, he chose not to come back, and I do think that somewhere in the mix there that my response to him, although I was trying to hold it, got in the way. And I think and I know from my supervision that I had to stop myself from identifying with his wife, which he was bringing into the room, who wasn't there, if it makes sense. So there's all of those layers going on. So that was a difficult one to write, but the aspects of George that I met in my clinical practice were difficult. It's tough work, but that's what we do.
That is what, of course, makes that approach to writing it and makes the way you do it just so engrossing, is because it is very real, and you do engage with those sorts of dilemmas, and the reader ends up there, with you, thinking, ooh.
Yes. Oh, and Andrew, I should mention, if I can just mention him one more time.
It's a lovely story. It's very moving, Andrew's story.
So he came in, as you know, with, as I said earlier, with chronic pain. And what is so moving about his story is that he was very defended at the start. And we worked together for a long time in this story, but also in reality. But what came forward for him, and it's worth mentioning, as we come into midlife, it's my belief that because our hormones are declining, we also have some echoes and if you like, parallels with how we came into puberty, so from childhood. And as you know, with Andrew, one of the things that came up was severe relational trauma in his childhood, which wasn't what he came for per se, but his relationships around the time he was coming to meet me were in tatters. So we naturally did go back there. But what we noticed is that he was, through this exploration of the vulnerable parts of him, he was able to really go into parts of self. And one of the parts of his self that he was able to really access was this very, very early self that had very profound relational trauma. And he had gosh, I don't even know if I can talk about it without tears. But he had, as you know, this immensely powerful moment where he was the strong, well, no, not the strong, the adult, the compassionate adult, felt able to take the injured child by the hand, quite literally, and say, it's okay, you're safe. And I don't think I've ever had such a profound moment in my work. And that moment, in different ways, it's not the exact representation, but that moment will stay with me for a really long time. And the reason I mention it is not to go, oh, look, what an amazing piece of work, but it's just to say that I think sometimes it's a good example of how the transition particularly for men, where they tend to find more of that vulnerability can sit within it, can bring new awareness of and heal, if you like, aspects of the past that perhaps we wouldn't get to if it was an earlier time in their life.
Yeah. Going back to something you've mentioned earlier, which is the binary approach to the topic. I mean, you have men, you have stories about women. There's so little information and research available out there into trans men and trans women's experience of midlife and menopause. And I know you reached out to some people and they were, cautious, reluctant for good reasons, which you acknowledge in the book. But I know you also did an awful lot of research, you read widely. What did you learn from that research? Can you give us a snapshot?
Yes, I can, and I can definitely give you a snapshot because it is quite short and sweet. I had I interviewed Stella Duffy, who is a writer, psychotherapist, now published author, on her own postmenopausal research. She is possibly one of the most direct people I've ever spoken to, and I loved it, but wow. And she was very, very helpful in setting me straight on this. She said, Helen, you are part of the problem. You need to acknowledge that. You are white, cis, heterosexual, middle class, West. I mean, she just listed all of those characteristics. So she said, you are really part of the problem. So, there's not much you can do about that. But what you can do is acknowledge it. And she said to me, actually, and others said to me, first of all, acknowledge it. Second of all, never make assumptions, always ask. But don't ask in a patronizing way. Track people's experiences. And there's a chapter in the book where I talk about and I represent a client actually who had chosen not to have children. I think this is I think a good example of that. I had made assumptions, I think, somewhere, not conscious assumptions. I'd made assumptions that her menopause might have some themes to it. So anybody's menopause might have some themes to it, like the loss of biological, the kind of depletion of hormones, and therefore can no longer choose to have children. And when you read the book, you will see that she really pulled me up on that. And I wasn't tracking her. I'd made a set of assumptions and I shouldn't have. In the same way as we might make assumptions. I was talking earlier. In fact, it was Stella who said to me, when you're in a same-sex relationship, as she is, she said, that it's not that you're going through the same thing at the same time. Please don't assume that. You're actually doing, this, which makes it all the more complicated because she told me, people say to her, well, it must be the same for you and your partner. She said, of course it's not. We're completely different people. But what you've just done is kind of assumed a set of things and then kind of multiplied it by two. So I think know your filters. I said I would answer this fast. I didn't. I appreciate, but never assume. Check your own set of privileges or filters, whichever and acknowledge them. Ask, represent, make sure. I mean, you and I had this conversation. I remember Catherine in the cafe, and I said, I want to go and I want to speak to as many people as possible. And you the one who said to me, you're kind of probably not going to be welcome in some communities because there is so much harm done, actually, so much harm done, particularly within the medical model, towards people who don't fit whatever we decide as a society is the norm, right? The norm, not the norm, the dominant narrative. That I became, again, part of the problem. So sorry, I've kind of rattled around that, but I think ask, represent, be curious. If you don't know something, don't assume, and read widely, which is what I did to try to get around it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, Black women and men are going to experience the same sort of problems, obviously. as research is constantly telling us, certainly around sort of childbirth, those sorts of issues. But I think there was a very recent survey I noticed in the news about Black women being less likely to be prescribed HRT, whether that's because they don't ask for it or whether it's because a GP just doesn't bother to even suggest it. So cultural differences. How you know?
Yeah. This was a really, I think this is a topic in and of itself that deserves probably quite a lot of discussion. But in the research I did, and then certainly within my clients, and within the book, actually, I talk about one client who's going through something similar. But I think so I'll give an example. I was talking to a lady who runs a community for menopausing whilst Black, and she is from Zimbabwe. And what she told me really helped for me to open up the understanding about how we travel into midlife for anybody is largely dominated by how our parents' generation, our mothers, our aunties, for women I'm talking about now, represented it and experienced it. So if I count for myself, it wasn't really spoken about when I was growing up. But what Bonnie told me, what the lady from Zimbabwe told me, and she's now running a number of initiatives in a training organisation, that in her country and in her community of origin, she came to the UK when she was 30. The women in her community didn't talk about menopause because once they reached menopause, such as it was, the husbands were allowed to take a new wife or at least a new partner, sexual partner. So it wasn't spoken about. So it doesn't the story there doesn't matter, but the impact is it wasn't spoken about. So that was number one, which I found quite interesting, because how we see older generations experiencing this will of course impact how we experience it and whether we talk about it, whether we don't. When she came to the UK, another interesting thing happened. She started having menopausal symptoms very early, and quite violently, I would say. And as a result, sought a lot of medical help. Found that quite difficult as a woman of colour in the UK with English not as her first language. Found that difficult. I mean, that's another conversation entirely, but wasn't getting any clarity or any answers. And her symptoms, she's since discovered, were so pronounced because she'd moved to the UK and she had an extreme lack of vitamin D, which was impacting her menopausal symptoms quite severely. As was her diet change, because she's since found that foods like yams and root vegetables, some of which she couldn't readily get here, were actually helping keeping her symptoms at bay. So when she came to the UK, she didn't have that. So I suppose what I'm saying in a long roundabout way is that there are multiple factors that will impact it that aren't just about perhaps how we grow up, how society treats us. But I think, again, I would go back to what I said just now, by being curious, by asking the questions, by looking at things holistically, which I do suggest. I certainly do that much more now in my clinical practice, is also to look at all of the factors that surround a client that comes to therapy, not just what's in the room. Certainly in this instance, and this lady wasn't my client, but in this instance, she was able to find some answers and therefore and educate herself, and therefore kind of sit inside her power as she went through that transition.
I mean, it is very much an example of the social biological interface that actually counsellors are working with an awful lot. But you can't ignore the biological, basically.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Okay, well, let's turn now to the writing process, because I mean, I know a lot of counsellors aspire to do what you do and turn their work and their learning into a book. So how do your books emerge? And I know it's a lot of hard work.
Yeah, I think so. Certainly, the first my first book, which I'm still getting used to saying, my first book, so Living Well and Dying Well, it absolutely flowed out of me. And what I would say is, if you're in something that really, really makes you passionate, I do feel it's easier. And I'm also very political, small p, and I often am drawn to work and writing that is not yet popular, or not, let me say, different way of saying it, that's not being written about. I get cross about that. When I was trying to represent counselling with older generations and end of natural life, I was really cross